A genuine conservative who was so conservative that Thomas Jefferson wouldn't let his works be read at the University of Virginia when he created it, namely David Hume, a major 18th century figure who indeed was a true conservative. He has a book called Principles of Government, or something like that, in which he discusses, he raises in it what he regards as, describes as kind of a paradox of government, and it's very real, and very real today too. He said, he said, look, if you look at any government in the world, whether it's the most oppressive state or the most free, you always find one constant, namely force is in the hands of the governed. The people who are being ruled, they basically have the force if they get together and use it. So how come they submit to authority, which almost invariably is used to harm them? That's the paradox. And then he says, well, of course, force is, you can control people by force, but he says that's not enough. He says ultimately it's opinion. It's through opinion only that the governed submit, meaning thought control. You control people's minds. You can control them even though they have the power. Well, that's what the struggle for democracy has been all about. And sometimes it goes forward, sometimes it goes backwards. Recent years have been going backwards. But it can go forwards again. That means, people are certainly capable of thinking. They're capable of understanding things. They need information. They need opportunities. They need forums. They need organizations. But those are things that are created by human will and human activity. They don't grow out of, they don't come from molecules meeting or cosmological forces. So, people want to create them, they create them. And that can make the difference, exactly as Hume said and indeed feared, because he didn't want the public to be involved.
Professor Chomsky, if I could just make a brief announcement,
sure.
Would you be willing to answer the questions of the people who are standing there?
Oh, sure.
Nobody more.
Oh, yeah. Okay, we got a little bit of a relief. The people who are standing there, but nobody more. I can't see how many there are with the light. Four more. Okay, you guys get your chance.
Just make a quick announcement before that. If I could just before that make an announcement, there are some response sheets that we've passed out. If before you leave, I just want to make sure we get everybody before you leave. If you could pass them in toward the center aisle, because they're extremely important to us for scheduling future guests. Okay, and
okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Bruce Critt. I'm a student at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I never fail to vote, but from what you're describing about both the Republican administrations and the Democratic administrations, specifically Clinton, Carter, and Kennedy, as well as the Nixon administration, I wonder, maybe my voting power, my ability to change the system by voting seems a little bit limited. And also, of course, the other possibility is just getting the information out, which was something else that you suggested. I mean, even if everybody knew everything that you were saying, that you were talking about with regard to the collusion between the capitalists and the government of the United States, given the separation between policy and politics, what can we do, even after everybody in the world knows about these things, even if we succeeded in telling everybody about all of these things and everybody knew?
What do they do?
Specifically, what direct action can the population take? What are the most important direct actions that the population can take against this collusion, against this complex?
Yeah. Well, with regard to voting, I don't think there's a general principle. I mean, you just make your decisions. I don't think it's usually not a major decision, like it's not going to have a big effect on things. It may have some effect on things. So you just decide, like, is it important enough to have an effect in this and that case? And there's no general principle. But on the other question, what can be done? Well, everything can be done. Everything can be done up to the point of eliminating all structures of authority and repression. They're human institutions. They can be dismantled. If you ask yourself what's the most important, well, then, that's not the kind of thing you decide in a meeting like this. I mean, those are the kinds of decisions that come by serious thought among people who are really trying to institute change. Now, typically, given the world the way it is, you start with where the world is, okay? Like, you don't start by saying, okay, let's overthrow transnational corporations, okay? I think that's because it's just not within range, So you start with saying, look, here's where the world is. What can we begin to do? Well, you can begin to do things which will get people to understand better what the source of real power is and just how much they can achieve. Like, you can start by, say, first of all, you can start by getting us to stop torturing people, right? Like, there's easy things to do, or stop killing children in Cuba, let's say. Stop, massacring in East Timor. Those are easy things. So let's do those. First, do the easy things. With regard to the domestic scene, take, say, the crime bills. They're just, like I said, they're the domestic equivalent of death squads. The fact that they're targeting vulnerable populations who are being turned into people under military occupation, look, that's an easy one to change. You really just have to change opinion on that one. You aren't striking at the core of private power when you begin to have a civilized criminal system instead of a brutal, barbaric one. So that one, I think, is changeable. What about the war against children and families, another case that I mentioned? Well, that's another easy one. The the European-Japanese model, incidentally, it's not, I don't want to suggest it's so beautiful, except in comparison to ours, but those are countries very much like us. They have the same institutions, the same economy, and so on and so forth. They have simply, not been subjected to unilateral business power as much as here for all kind of historical reasons, and we can certainly become like those countries. There's, in fact, a model sitting right in front of you, countries very much like us. Take, say, health care. Well, the U.S. is off the spectrum on that one, too. Again, I think for the same reasons. Even if you just look a couple of miles to the north, there's a country very much like us, which happens to have instituted a semi-civilized, again, plenty of things wrong with it, but a semi-civilized system of health care not that far back in the 1960s, under conditions that we could easily duplicate. Well, those are things that are, I don't want to say those things are going to be easy, but they're within range. On things like GATT, you're getting into harder territory, because here crucial interests of authoritarian institutions are at stake. And then you're going to begin to face the fact, which after all is a fact that sooner or later you have to face, that maybe the most totalitarian institution in human history, or certainly close to it, is a corporation. It's an institution in which authority goes strictly from top to bottom. Ultimately, it's in the hands of owners and investors. If you're inside the system, you take orders from above and transmit them down. If you're outside the system, there are very weak popular controls, which indeed are eroding. I should say that this is not an insight of mine. It was pointed out by Thomas Jefferson in his later years when he warned, these are just the early days of corporations, he warned that if power was going to shift into the hands of what he called banking institutions and moneyed-in corporations, then the democratic experiment would be over. We'd be back to a form of absolutism worse than what they struggled against. Thomas Jefferson is not exactly a figure who's off the spectrum in American history. So this is not a new insight. It's as American as apple pie. We should recognize what Thomas Jefferson could see, in fact, Adam Smith. But when you see that, you realize that it's a hard nut to crack, because there are enormous agglomerations of power, indeed concentrating and indeed transnational, which are protected from scrutiny or from popular action, and that's got to change. After all, why do corporations have the rights they do? Why are they treated as immortal persons? Contrary to the warnings of people like Adam Smith and others, it was not by law. This was by decisions made in courts and by judges and by lawyers, which simply changed the climate totally, and that can be reversed too. Institutions can be under popular control, including the economic institutions. Well, organizing to try to achieve that is a much more long-term operation, but it's got to begin somewhere, So if you ask what should be done, well, I don't think any sane human being can look around at the world around them and not figure out things that have to be done. Take a walk through Baltimore, you'll find plenty of things that have to be done. So, you know, you get started doing. Some of them are broader in scale, so, you know, you think about those. But they're not gonna, you're not going to do them alone. Like if you take a walk down the streets of Baltimore and you say, oh yeah, that ought to be done, nothing's going to happen. On the other hand, if people are organized enough to act about it, yeah, they can achieve things, and there's no particular limit to what they can achieve. I mean, that's why we don't live under slavery or under feudalism and so on.
You mentioned specific organizations that are involved in breaking apart this collusion.
Even if you, what?
I know you can't mention specific actions, but can you mention organizations that are involved in working on this problem specifically?
Which problems?
The problem of collusion between corporations and government.
Well, you know, a lot of organizations are involved from different points of view. For example, I mean, like take, say, at one level, which is important, though of course superficial, Nader's Public Citizen is involved. But that's important, as I say, but kind of not really touching the structure.